Hello everyone. In this video I am going to explain the differences between three different displays in HTML and CSS, which is display block, display inline, and display inline block. Well, most of the elements in HTML, they have all HTMLs have a default display, and most of them have these three displays by default, and we need to understand these displays in order to have a better understanding of whole HTML and CSS, when we want to locate an element to a specific location or align an item, move item to left, things like that. So understanding these displays could very help you in so many circumstances that you do not even think. So let's start by an example, and we are going to start with an empty example, and here's where we start. Imagine that I have, for example, this is some text. I want to have some p tags. Okay, as you can see, I have created three p tags, and sure enough, if we see the result, we can see, let's even put the zoom on, for example, 200%, and you can see every item now has a block element. And a block element, the way that browser treats a block element is that it sets the width of that element from the very left to the very right. So if you take a look at this, the body has a little margin around it, and as you can see, this is the margin around the body, the orange area that is being displayed, and the blue area is the what remains for the other items to fill. And if you take a look at this, the other items inside that body, they now they also have a margin by default for p tag as well, but the blue area is the area that the content itself is occupying. And as you can see, it occupies from the very left to the very right. It's the way that a block element behaves. And as you can see, the browser is telling us that the display of a p tag is on block by default. Let's see another example. See, I copy all of these tags, and rather than using a p tag, I am going to use, for example, span tag. Now, if we come here and hit refresh, we can see now browser is treating differently with span tag. See, if we come here again, hit inspect on this, and sure enough, we can see that these span tags, they do not occupy space from the very left to the very right, but rather they are occupying the space as much as content they have. And sure enough, if they had more content, the width of the element would have been bigger. So this is the way that browser treats inline elements and treats block elements. And sure enough, we can customize the display of these elements via CSS. We can go ahead and set the display to something. For example, let's use a style tag here. And in a real world, do not use a style tag. Use a separate link to include your CSS file, but for this example, because I want to have everything inside one file, I use just this style tag. And sure enough, for example, we can apply a class of test to the third item, and we can go ahead and select that test and set the display to block, for example, and we change the behavior of this text. And sure enough, if we come back here, now this span is behaving like a block element because we forced the display on block, and it's no longer an inline element. So we can use CSS, this display CSS, to change the display of an element if you want to. But before we go on and talk about inline block, let's see some more differences between inline elements and block elements. So one difference of this between inline element and block element, we saw that the other difference is between margin. See, let's imagine because now that I look at it, the browser has some margins for default for some things. You can see that Browser has some margin for p tag for default for the body as well. So sometimes, usually developers, what they do is they use a star selector, and inside this star selector they usually put something like margin 0 in order to say, hey browser, do not use those default margins that you have, for example, for h1, for p, for body. I want to control the margins myself, so we set the margin of everything to 0, and we want to control the margins ourselves. And sure enough, if we hit refresh, so this is the result. We have no margin whatsoever. So now that we do not have any margin, let's control the margins ourselves. See, let's give another class to this, to the second one. We give it a class of P, and we call it paragraph, okay? Paragraph, okay? And we select this paragraph, okay? And let's imagine that I apply a margin to that, and the margin that I apply is 10 pixel. And also I apply a 10 pixel of margin to the span tag, and we will see that the answer would surprise you. Well, first of all, the margin for the p tag is just working fine. You can see the orange area. The p tag has a margin from all directions: left, top, bottom, right. But for the span tag, sorry, we set the display to block for the span tag. Let's comment that out to set the display to inline again. Hit refresh, and if we come here on the third item that has a test class, you can see it has a test class. Now the display is on inline because we commented that out. But if we take a look at the result, we see that the margin from the left is applied and also from the right is applied, but not from top and bottom. See, this is another difference between inline elements and block elements. They do not understand margin top and margin bottom. In fact, margin top and margin bottom is meaningless for inline elements because the answer is clear. It's inline elements. It wants to put the items in a line. So that's why margin top and margin bottom does not work on inline elements. And I can remember once I had a backend developer friend, and he was kind of mad, and he was saying, oh, CSS is so stupid, I hate CSS. He was really mad at CSS, and I talked to him, what's wrong? And he said, see, I have applied a margin top to this one and it doesn't work. It just doesn't listen to me. And I said that because the display of this element is on inline and margin top is meaningless for an inline element. So that's why I say when you understand these margin, this display inline and block and the differences that they have, they can help you in order to have a better life actually, because their writing codes will be so much easier when you understand these basic concepts of HTML and CSS. So this is another difference between block and inline. And of course, if we come here, see, and this is our paragraph, and let's apply another class to this one and call that, for example, paragraph 3. And let's use paragraph 2 for that one. We could have used nth child as well to select them, but let's apply a class. Okay, and now I'm going to select the paragraph 3, okay? And for this one, let's use text for this one. Text 3, okay? And so the test will be now text 3, and give a class to this one. Call it text 2, and we are going to select this 2 and apply some CSS properties so that you can understand. So for the paragraph 3, let's imagine that I am going to assign a height. For example, I'm going to say, hey, paragraph 3, you need to have a 200 pixel height. And sure enough, if we come back here, hit refresh, you can see that this is the our element here. This is we can see for the paragraph 3 we have applied a height of 200 pixels, and that is what happens. And don't forget, we have put the zoom on 200%, so that's why 200 pixel is looks very much. But for this one as well, let's apply this height 200 pixel to the inline element that we have, test to text 2. So come back here, hit refresh, and sure enough, we do not see that. And if you come here on test 2, we can see, sorry, let's relocate this again. You can see that the height is not applied, and if you come here and highlight it, it says that the display is inline and height is meaningless. So this is another difference that inline has. So they do not understand height, they do not understand margin top and bottom because they want to be an inline. So that's where the concept of an inline block element is now understandable, and you can feel that we need another thing that for the inline block. We imagine that we need something. Let's imagine that I want to have an element that these elements they don't act like a block element. They do not occupy a space from the very left to the very right. I want these, for example, I want some elements to be in one line, not in separate lines, but I want them to have margin top and margin bottom, or I want to apply height to this. So that's where we need inline block. So inline block, let's have some other tags here. For example, two other tag, imagine. For example, imagine a H6 tag, okay? We have three H6s. This is first heading, okay? And this is second heading, okay? Second heading, and this is third heading. So the default of H6 tag as default is on block. So that's why if we come here, we can see this H6 tags are there, but we can actually go ahead and assign this. For example, we can select H6 tags, all H6 tags, and we are going to assign a display of inline block to them, and of course we can have a class for them. For example, this would be our class. Let's give it a heading 1, and we can select them. So now that apply a display inline block to these H6s, what happens is they start to go in, not in separate lines, but they are going to be in one line, okay? And if you want to we can use BR tag to send them to the next line if we want to. For example, if we set a BR tag, what happens is it breaks and everything goes to the next line. Or we can use HR tag if you want to even have a horizontal line between them. So this is, I wanted to make them separate with all those span tags that we had. And of course I can select the for example dot heading 1. Now it acts like an inline element completely. They do not occupy space from the very left to the very right, but the difference is they accept margin right, margin top, and margin bottom. For example, if I say margin top for this one, for example 15 pixel, it works. And also if I give a height to that, for example a height of 75 pixel, and also it still works. And if you come here, hit refresh on this inspect element tool on our heading 1, you can see that this is our heading 1. It has a margin top. The margin top is actually working, and also the height is working because this is the height of the second element. The height is as much as content that it has, and this is the height of the first element. You can see that blue area that is occupying. And also if you want to make sure that the height is like that, we can actually use, for example, a border so that we can see the area that it's occupying. For example, a 1 pixel, not 1, let's use 2 pixel, solid, for example, black. See, this is the area that it's occupying. So you can see the height is now applied to this, but the height does not work for these two, and margin. So this is the differences that I wanted you to know. So these are all the necessary differences that you needed to know about block, inline, and inline block. And before I finish this video, there are two notes that I'm going to talk about. First of all, it's a good idea to know some of elements that what display they have by default. For example, p tag, div tag, h1, h2, h3, they are block elements by default. But a button, an input, input tag. They are inline block, IMG, the IMG tag when we import an image to our project. They are inline. But tags like, for example, span tag, B tag, or strong tag, for example, things like that, they are inline elements. So, and even if you once you forgot that an element, what display that it has, you can first all check out the documentation, or you can also, for example, for this spawn, you can see that all of them, they have a computed section, okay, and they have a display. You can say, go inside the computed section and see the display, and you can see the display is on inline, and it's coming from the browser itself, because the text, you can see it's grayed out. But for this one, if you hit inspect on this element and go inside computed section, you can see for the display, it's inline block, but it's not grayed out. Okay, it has something, and we can even click on this to see where this inline block comes from. We can click on this and it says, hey, you have a selector inside your code and you have set the display on inline block yourself. So this is one thing that I wanted to say before finishing this video. And the second thing, I think it's very necessary and it's actually very important, because some elements, they have a width of fit content, and this width of fit content sometimes mixes up things and makes us things hard to understand. What do I mean by that? For example, let's use another HR tag here. Again, I wrote H1, I don't know why, HR. And imagine that I have an input tag here. The input type is text, and let's apply a class to this and call it, for example, the input. Okay. And sure enough, if we come here, hit refresh, we can see there is an input here. If we hit right click on this and set inspect element and go inside computed section, and inside computed section, the display, you can see it's on inline block. And if we click on this, it says that the display inline block comes from the user agent style sheet, which that user agent style sheet is the default things that the browser has. So the display of this element is on inline block, right? So if we go ahead and set the display of this element to block, what happens is the element will go and occupy from the very left to the very right. This is what we expect. In fact, see, this is, for example, let's give it a class of text1, and sure enough, this span is an inline element, right? And sure enough, if we come here and say text1, yeah, hey, you should have a display of block. What happens is, if we come here, you can see now the display of this element is on block, and if we right click on this, hit inspect on this, you can see that the blue area is the area of this span tag, and it's now a block element. It's occupying from the very left to the very right. So now let's do the same thing for this input tag that we have. See, the input has a class of the input, okay, and we come here, select it, and set the display to block, just like what we did for the text one. And now if we save the code, come here, hit refresh, we are surprised. See, the element had a text, and you can see it went from the very left to the very right. But the input tag, we applied the display of block to this, but wait a minute, it's not now occupying from the very left to the very right. You can see this is the input. You can see the area. You can see if you can zoom a little even more, or let's change the dimension of the Google Chrome that we have here, because it's now gone to the bottom left, and usually bottom left is not a good place for those who are watching a video. So the input is now acting weird. What is the reason? Well, actually, the display of block, yes, it has been applied. And even if we hit inspect element on this, we can see that ourselves. We can see this input has occupied from the very left to the very right, but it has an orange area. See, the span tag that the first span, it has a blue area, and you can see the content is from the very left to the very right, but all of them is a blue area. And also when you come here to the input, again, the element, yes, it is from the very left to the very right. So yes, the display block is actually working. But we see an orange area. At first glance, you may think, okay, orange area means margin. It has a margin. No, The point is, inputs, they have a width of fit content by default. What does that width fit content do? For example, let's this text one that we have. Let's set the width of this element to fit content. Sorry, fit content. What happens is, if we come back here, hit refresh, and let's apply a border to the text one so that we can see the area that it's occupying. Let's set border 1 px solid black, for example, solid red. Okay, we can see, come back here now, hit refresh, you can see this is the area of the span tag, and if we remove that width fit content, you can see that this is the area of the span tag. So now you are getting the point, I think. So the width fit content, what it does, the display, yes, is on block. It's occupying from the very left to the very right. But when you set the width content to fit width to fit content, this is what happens. And in fact, it's different with display inline block, because you can see that the second text and the third text are pushed down to the next line. And if we had no CSS property for this, for example, let's comment these two out, the display block and display inline block. What happens is these two elements will come to next to each other and they are not pushed down to the next line. But when we set the display of block, it pushes the other elements to the next line because there's not enough space for them. And if we set the width on fit content, what happens is the width is on fit content, but the element is actually from the very left to the very right. So this is something that I wanted to mention for the input things. This will help you one day, because one day you may want to say, okay, I want this input to be a block element because I want this input to occupy from the very left to the very right. And you assign a display of block to the input, and you come here, hit refresh, and you say, why it's not working? So this is something that you need to have in mind. For these circumstances, you can set the width of that element to 100% yourself, so the width fit content will be removed, and now sure enough you have the result that you wanted, and the width is on 100%. And since it has a little border around it, so the width of the element is 100%, yes, okay, and it has a little, this input that we have, okay, it has a border. By default it has a border, for example 1 pixel or 2 pixels. That 1 pixel or 2 pixel width is causing the element to become a little bigger than 100%. See, if we come here, hit inspect on this element, in the computed section, it's showing us this is the element itself. It occupying 100% of the width, and it has 2 pixel of padding from the left, okay, and a 2 pixel padding from the right, so this is 4 pixel. 2 border from the left and 2 border from the right, so this is 8 pixels. So it has, the width of this element is actually 100% plus 8 pixels. So it goes a little bigger than 100%. So that's why we have this scroll bar down here. We can fix this by by box sizing. See, this is there's something in CSS called box sizing. Box sizing is actually something that we are saying, browser, hey browser, what do we mean by width? When we say, for example, width 100 pixels or 100%, or even height, when we say height is 200 pixels, what do we mean by width and height? Do we mean the, let's bring that box sizing again. Do we mean, let's bring it back, do we mean, when we say, for example, width 200 pixels, do we mean width of the element itself, or no? Do we mean the element with the padding and with the border? And margin is something else. Margin is an external space, so that is something that we never consider as a part of the element itself. But the border and padding, yes. So there's something called box sizing, which the default value of box sizing is on content box. This is the default value, content box. This box sizing content box, it means that when we say width 100% or 100 pixels, we mean the element itself. So that's why padding and border would cause the input to grow bigger. But if we set this content box to border box, this box size into border box, it means, hey browser, when we say width 100% or 100 pixels or anything, we mean the width of the element and the padding and the border. They all together should add up to 100%. So if you come back here, hit refresh, we no longer see that scroll at the bottom of the page, because sure enough, the element does have a 100% width, and this is 100%, and everything is good. And if you want it to not to go very low, we can actually set a margin bottom for this one, margin bottom, and of course the display of this is on block, so margin bottom is meaningful for that. If it was on inline, margin bottom was meaningless for that. So we can actually apply a margin bottom and say, for example, 100 pixels, so that we have a 100 pixel at the down of it, so that we do not see that we can actually scroll a little bit, so we have some extra space. So this is it. This is all I wanted you to know about display inline block and inline block and inline. And also, I think the box sizing and this with fit content is something that you also need to know, so that you can understand this display block and inline block very better and more deeply. So this is it. That's enough for this video. Hope that I helped you, and hope to see you in my next videos.